This episode, we will be looking back in time to Operation Desert Storm and learning about leadership and lessons learned from the perspective of the regiment's most senior soldier and the perspective of the regiment's most junior soldier.
Training for war had always been the emphasis in the 2nd Dragoons.
What were some of the fears or unknowns that you had as a leader or that you saw in the formation, and how did you handle them?
You know, in combat, you can't over-supervise. You can only do your job.
Somehow, there was 2 prisoners that were unaccounted for.
And our soldiers witnessed a lot of brutality on the part of the Iraqis against their own people.
The other thing that stood out to me that's always been the hallmark of a cavalry unit or a good mounted unit is radio discipline.
There are projections that our operation was going to entail huge casualties.
Hello, Dragoons. This is Dragoon 6. This year, we are celebrating the 30th anniversary of Operation Desert Storm. And with us, we have a very special guest and episode. It's my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome Lieutenant General Retired L.D. Holder onto Kill Tank Radio, the podcast of the 2nd Cavalry Regiment. He served as the 65th Colonel of the regiment from 1989 to 1991, and he was the Regimental Commander that led the 2nd Cavalry Regiment during Operation Desert Storm. Sir, thank you so much for joining us, and for the audience who doesn't know you, please give us a little bit of your background.
Hello, Dragoons. It's good to be with you. I have a long background in the 2nd Cavalry Regiment. I served with the regiment 3 times, beginning in the distant year 1966. I came out of Texas A&M in 1966, went through the basic schools, and my first unit of assignment was 3rd Squadron, 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, which was then located in Amberg. I was assigned to K Troop, and in K Troop, I got my foundation in the profession, and because of the turbulence of the time, I wound up succeeding to command of that troop as a 2nd lieutenant after 8 months of being in the unit. I returned to the regiment twice more, had a total of 8 years in the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. I was on the regimental staff from 77 to 80. I did my squadron command with the Brave Rifles, 3rd ACR in Fort Bliss at the time, and then returned, as Colonel Ewers said, to command the regiment in 89. And to see Germany reunited and the communist regime in Czechoslovakia fall apart was a good experience. When we were called to deploy to Saudi Arabia as part of Desert Shield, I was 46 years old. I'd been in command of the regiment for 18 months. I felt very, very confident in the regiment, its soldiers, its equipment, and its training. I retired in 1997, having commanded 3rd Infantry Division and been the Commandant of the Command and General Staff College and Commander of the Combined Arms Center.
All right, sir. Well, thank you so much for that glimpse back into what is a really incredible career with just some amazing achievements, and to know that you had spent as much time in the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment as you did, and what a profound impact that it had on your development as a leader is really, really special for this particular audience. So I would share with you as well that as you reminisce on the border patrol duties of the Cold War days, we currently have a squadron with a field artillery battery and a sapper platoon forward stationed with Battle Group Poland in support of the NATO mission, doing a very similar mission. A lot of the commonalities are really striking, so it brings me back to think about the regiment of that time. So thank you, sir, for that description.
Yeah, I'm aware that you guys are doing that, and I think it's great leader development and training to have your squadrons and your troops out on semi-independent operations away from the regimental headquarters. It was very important to us in the years when we had that border mission.
You know, in terms of leader development, the opportunities there for training, empowered action, for initiative, responsibility are just really tremendous. Okay, sir, so I'd like to just paint the picture a little bit. While this episode will have some history in it, our purpose is to learn from previous Dragoons, to look back and find those leadership lessons that can help today's Dragoons to succeed. At the beginning of the episode, I mentioned that we would look at Desert Storm through the perspective of the regiment's most senior soldier. Clearly, that is Lieutenant General Holder, then Colonel Holder. We also get to look at the perspective of the most junior soldier. So for those of you who don't know, I was a young 19 Delta Cavalry Scout in 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. I am that most junior soldier. Now, I don't know that for a fact, but I'm fairly certain because I was an 18-year-old Private E1 that reported to 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment on December 1st of 1990, which was just 7 days before I went wheels up with the main body. So if there's someone out there that's more junior, give me a call and we'll compare notes. Now, I remember that the Iraqi military in 1990 was reportedly the 4th largest in the world. It was well-funded. It was battle-tested from the Iran-Iraq War. We would likely have to fight in MOP 4 or a quite devious creation that came about in the desert, and sir, you probably remember this, the dreaded MOP 5, which hasn't been seen much in the Army. But as we looked at the effects or the consistency of the mustard gas that we thought we might face, someone came up with the idea that if we put our wet weather suit over the MOP gear, that would make us even more protected, which I don't disagree with that, or at least I don't have a reason to disagree with it. But what I would say is that in the middle of the Saudi Arabian desert, as hot as it is, to be in MOP 4 is bad enough. And to put that wet weather top and bottom on over top of that in the proverbial MOP 5 was a real low point for the soldiers of the regiment.
Let me add that was a local initiative. I'm learning about MOP 5 this morning. It seems on the face of it a pretty bad idea in the desert, but awareness of chemical threats was very high among the soldiers. It was a big deal at the time, a serious threat. And I remember whenever I went around railheads or ports and found soldiers just training with their first-line supervisors, they were quite often talking about chemical defense.
That MOP 5 probably was a creation of someone very near to me in my local area, but I'll tell you, we certainly did that. I don't think it was well thought through and probably was just a local thing as you described. I would say and add for part of the storyline here, along with being the youngest soldier in my troop and the most junior soldier in my troop, while we're on the topic of NBC warfare, I had the dubious distinction of being the unmasking private. And as you remember, sir, that was the steps that we took. Should your 256 chemical detection kit not work, then you needed a human on call to hand over their weapon and begin the sequential unmasking procedures while the members of the platoon gathered around and watched to see if any chemical effects would be visible. And so I was that guy. You know, when I think about my experience back in the desert, one of the things we would do is rehearse that drill, which was a little bit psychologically devastating.
Yeah, that's a high honor, of course, to be chosen to have that job. I remember we also counted on camels to some degree when that was available. You could look around at the wildlife and see if there was actually a threat. That did occur when we had Scuds come in.
So 2nd Cavalry Regiment at the time was an armored cavalry regiment, and you referenced that as in your opening. But as an armored cavalry regiment looked very different than the Stryker Cavalry Regiment of today. And I wondered if you'd like to describe that formation a little bit for us, sir. Yeah,
the Armored Cavalry Regiments were rare and highly capable units. They're about the size of the Stryker Brigades of today, 4,500 soldiers, but they were organized differently. They were optimized for reconnaissance, security, and economy of force. And the organization of the regiment included 3 armored cavalry squadrons, a regimental combat aviation squadron, and then a number of separate troops, engineers, MI, and chemical defense. The 3 cavalry squadrons had themselves 3 armored cavalry troops, Bradleys and tanks. A tank company, which was their own reserve, helped them with semi-independent operations, and a howitzer battery. We didn't have the howitzer battalion that you guys have got. We had 3 separate batteries with the cavalry squadrons. All our battery commanders were second-time commanders. All the maneuver commanders got very good at application of indirect fire. So you had a really robust combined arms team at the battalion level, the Armored Cavalry Squadron. In addition to that, we had the 4th Squadron, the Regimental Combat Aviation Squadron, 3 reconnaissance troops, and 2 attack troops, along with a general support aviation company, about 76 airframes. So it was a big outfit. It was a very agile outfit. It was designed to operate on a wide front in those missions I mentioned, reconnaissance, security, economy of force. Characteristically, a regiment would get about a division-size sector with a mission to delay or defend even. Normally, we were reinforced for our general defense plan missions. We'd have a tank battalion, a couple of tank battalions, plus about a brigade of artillery and a battalion of engineers. And for Desert Storm, we received similar attachments. We didn't get the ground tank battalion, but we got an attack aviation battalion of Apaches, 210th Artillery Brigade, and the 82nd Engineers joined us to round out the Dragoon battle group for Desert Storm. We had a lot of other attachments to a big logistics support group that helped us out, and there are a number of smaller units.
that helps me as well to visualize exactly everything that the regiment had going for it. Certainly the ACR, the Armored Cavalry Regiment, is a much heralded formation for all the reasons you've described. One of its great advantages is that permanent task organization, a lot of things that our current leaders only experience as we task organize for a particular mission or a particular deployment, but the task organization was an enduring and permanent structure within the ACR.
I'm an armor officer, but I never served with a tank company or a tank battalion. All of my time was with cavalry units. So there was an element of knowing each other, which also improved the combat effectiveness of those regiments.
I served in Comanche Troop 1st Squadron, and I remember, and that was the first real Army organization I was a part of. As I said, I arrived, that was my first assignment, and line troop within the ground squadron. It had 1st and 3rd platoons was cavalry scouts manning 6 Bradleys per platoon, and 2nd and 4th platoon was 19 kilo tankers manning M1s, 8 per platoon. And then, of course, the troop commander had a tank, and the troop XO had a Bradley, and that brought the total to 13 Bradleys and 9 tanks. Well, as I fast forwarded, now 13 years later, and found myself serving as a mechanized infantry company commander heading back for Operation Iraqi Freedom, I had a mechanized infantry company, and it had 14 Bradleys in it. You can see just the difference in a side-by-side comparison there, just an amazing amount of firepower, and the way that the platoons, for me and 1st platoon and our 2nd platoon of tankers, the Bradleys and the tanks working together was really something special.
Yeah, the ACRs were designed, of course, to operate away from the core main body, and we were sometimes as much as 30 miles ahead of the divisions. Having big, robust cavalry troops and a lot of combat support was necessary to do that mission.
So, sir, that leads us to our first question. Today's Army needs to be prepared for conflict with a near-peer adversary. When you took over the regiment, it appeared to be a similar situation. Could you please talk about how you developed that readiness prior to the deployment and also while we awaited operations?
Training for war had always been the emphasis in the 2nd Dragoons. Every time I served with them, we focused very hard on our general defense plan, which was a specific defensive mission. But we focused on that mission and doing it. We understood that it was going to be a very violent and turbulent fight, so we had a set of skills at every level that we trained on, and we ran a cyclical training program to sustain readiness over the year. We always combined fire and maneuver in our training. The regiment long had standard SOPs for maneuvers, formations, battle drills, and fire support. And that's where we spent our time. We worked at being very good at those fundamental tasks. And one of the things that made us different from other units in Europe, I guess, was we emphasized platoon gunnery over crew gunnery. It really paid off for us in combat. It's important that you're good at your crew system, that you can fight your tank, or your Bradley, your Striker, or whatever your vehicle is. But unless you can deliver fire effectively as a platoon with proper distribution and control, you really won't fight very well. And you saw, I think, the benefit of that in all the regiment's combat operations in Desert Storm. The best known of these is Eagle Troops fight, coming over a rise and finding a battalion of Iraqi tanks in front of it. But at that point, this business about platoon fire, proper distribution and control of tank-killing fires was very, very important. They did not double service targets. They did not waste ammunition or have questions about who shot where. They had trained for that, and that's what they did.
Just from my own perspective, I remember there were many things that I observed in the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. With it being my first unit, I just thought that's how things were. But as I got into other units and got into other maneuver scenarios, whether that was at a combat training center or whether that was back in another deployed environment, I had a better and clearer and deeper appreciation for just how good that formation was.
When we got alerted for Desert Storm, we sat down and had a training meeting and adjusted our training plan so that we could adapt to offensive operations in the desert. And when we arrived in Saudi Arabia, got through the ports, had our equipment and all that, we had a plan for training. It was going to take us through platoon, troop, squadron, regiment, and we executed that plan just short of the regimental exercise when we were called on to attack and shaped exactly what we were doing.
Being a young soldier in the back of a Bradley, a dismounted scout, and a loader, I would tell you it seemed like everything was wired tight because there wasn't a whole lot of, other than the natural confusion of just a developing scenario in front of you. I think the other thing that stood out to me that's always been the hallmark of a cavalry unit or a good mounted unit is radio discipline, the ability to speak clearly and concisely using the proper words, and it just was always impressive to me to hear how much discipline there was on the net.
Yeah, that was also essential in those kind of operations. And if you're out doing reconnaissance or even economy of force, it's really important that you report and fight at the same time so that your higher headquarters knows what's going on. When I was going to Germany in 1989 to take command of the regiment, I flew out of JFK Airport. And we were all flying in civilian clothes on charter aircraft, and I heard a couple of the NCOs talking to each other, saying, when you get there, you'll be offered a couple of assignments in Europe. You want to avoid the ACRs. You train very hard, and there's no slack. My reaction to that, though I said nothing, was, this is great. I want that kind of self-selection. What we want and need are serious soldiers who understand what they're getting into and are ready to train as hard as we will. Yeah, I hope you guys maintain the proper cavalry arrogance. We were loud and obnoxious and very, very proud of ourselves and all that. But beneath that, there's a real solid basis of hard work that supports it.
Sir, a large portion of our audience today are the fine non-commissioned officers, soldiers, and junior officers of the regiment. Can you discuss the role that they had and why they made 2nd ACR so successful in the desert?
The non-commissioned officers of the regiment were outstanding. They had to perform every day, and they were frequently evaluated in how they did that. The regimental sergeant major for my entire command was Sergeant Major Rich Ross, and he was in charge of NCO professionalism along with the squadron commanders. What I found out in cavalry operations, especially because they're widely distributed, is you don't fight effectively at all unless you have good leadership in the squads and sections. There can be no weak links in the chain of command. And so we stressed that, and our principle was to delegate responsibility to the lowest level of competence. That is, let the leader who's capable of doing the job do the job and take responsibility without a lot of supervision. Sergeant Major Ross's motto for the NCOs was never walk away from a deficiency. You don't tolerate anything less than perfection in everything you do. That certainly applies to training. So the non-commissioned officers were critical to our success.
And, sir, I appreciate you describing that. I'm routinely struck by how many principles are timeless. And when we review the importance of non-commissioned officers and the importance of not walking past a deficiency, no weak links in the chain, everything that you've described is absolutely pertinent today and things that we continue to stress and emphasize in the regiment of 2021.
That's great because, in combat, you can't over-supervise. You can only do your job. So you've got to raise everybody and train everybody and expect everybody to do his own part in that.
Sir, deploying tanks from Germany to Saudi Arabia is no easy feat. Can you talk us through the timeline? What were things you did well and maybe some things that didn't go so well?
Yeah, we had an interesting experience in deployment. We got notified via television. The President of the United States announced that 7th Corps was going to deploy. We had a lot of rumors of that, of course. The soldiers are very anxious about that, and it got to be kind of difficult in the late going because there was a perception that leadership knew something that the soldiers didn't and weren't passing that out. That was not the case. When we did get notified, the regiment was told that we'd be second in line for the Corps, that we'd have 7 to 10 days before we started moving to port because General Franks, the Corps commander, wanted to get his support command established in theater before he sent in the combat units. That lasted about 24 hours. I was in Bamberg with the 2nd Squadron in their dining facility when General Franks called up and said, the COSCOM can't go. They have too many manning shortages. I want you to start deploying tomorrow. And so they sent trains to our squadron stations, and we began employing the next day. And the soldiers were magnificent. The soldiers were just great. They took that challenge and jumped on it, loaded trains. And we were fortunate in that because we were first in line, we got the roll-on, roll-off ships, the best transports in the Army. And we were able to put a squadron on each of 6 ships, which was a great advantage. Units behind us were divided between multiple ships. They were later in the deployment and all that. So we arrived in Dhahran in squadron sets, soldiers well ahead of their equipment, which was not a good feature of the deployment. And we got our stuff off, combat loaded it. We had to paint it for the desert and then arrange transport to move north. The local transport, getting from Dhahran up to our defensive sector, was the hardest part of moving the heavy equipment. There weren't enough transports in country. We were leasing everything in sight, but it eventually got done. We moved from the ports to the desert between 8th or 10th of December until about the 20th, 23rd of December. Aviation was a harder part of that because there were modifications that had to be done to the aircraft before they could be flown out there into the desert.
Yeah, one of the things that I remember, sir, and certainly you were talking about SOPs and training and proficiency. One of the things that is very important even to the strikers, and I know was important to the ACR, was load plans. And so at the individual unit level, I know one of the curveballs that got thrown to us was we moved those M3A1s out of Germany, but then we turned around and drew those brand new M2A2 Bradleys. As a young soldier, I didn't know. I just knew that a brand new Bradley showed up with the new car smell, and it was an infantry fighting vehicle. And because of that, it did not have, the Cav crew was supposed to be a 5-man crew, driver, gunner, BC, loader, and dismount. And in the back of that thing, it was configured for an infantry squad, not for, and the Cav variant had less seats and more ammo carriers. And the infantry thing had more seats and less ammo carriers. So we had to modify that. I remember pulling the large middle seat console out and burying it in the desert somewhere. And I remember ratchet strapping down as much ammo as we could carry and laying tow missiles on top of one another with styrofoam in between. And we loaded that thing to the gills, leaving just enough space for really the loader and the dismount to fit in the back there. So that was an interesting wrinkle in the management of that vehicle. And I know that load plans were an important part of the training proficiency.
Yeah, absolutely. That's important that everybody's loaded the same way because you get replacement people, you get replacement vehicles, you move from one vehicle to the next, and it's got to be the same. We got a lot of new equipment during that deployment. We didn't have any GPS when we hit the desert. We didn't even know about GPS, and of course it was essential out there. But sticking with the scout vehicles, we had a much more capable vehicle in the M2. It shot the TOW-2A, which the M3s did not. It had better armor. It had a better engine. Some of the vehicle commanders really didn't want to give away their M3s, but the M2s were a better track.
Yes, sir. And I remember it had a bigger engine, and it was already painted, and it was ready to go. It had the new car smell. So I think we were excited that it was maybe going to be more reliable or more survivable. So, but other than having to get very creative with how to load all that ammo, that was certainly a challenge.
Yeah, and I know you guys went back and dug up those center seats again and reinstalled them when we were done. There was a funny incident with that. General Schwarzkopf got to the regiment one time late in January. He had an enormous command, but he came out and visited us and came to the regimental CP, and we gave him the briefing. And then he flew out to talk to soldiers at L Troop, and he made a good presentation out there at L Troop, and then stood for questions. And he got some of the usual questions, but about the third question long, a scout section sergeant said, "Hey, sir, they're making us take these new Bradleys. Do we have to do that? I like my old track." And General Franks was standing next to me. And we didn't get those Bradleys without a little fight. The 1st Infantry Division wanted those too. And General Franks had come down on our side because we were going to be first to make contact with the Republican Guards who wanted us to have that armor. But he looked at me when that soldier asked that question and said, "If you don't want those things, I know someone who does."
Logistics, the sustainment warfighting function continues to be one of the hardest things that we do. And so when we think about multimodal deployment, multimodal transportation, that's exactly what the regiment faces here today in Europe. Moving by over land via roads, that's one of the great operational values of the Stryker Brigade is to be able to move operational level distances out of contact rapidly. But we also use trains and planes and ships, as you described. We've done deployments via ship in the Black Sea and whatnot. So I think that's all very fitting.
But you make a good point about operational mobility. The fact that strikers can move very fast over considerable distances, that matters too. General Schwarzkopf's move to the west, we moved 2 corps, 18th and 7th Corps to the west. It was about 200-kilometer move for us in 7th Corps. And there's a lot of logistics planning that supports that, and it did not go that well. I expect that you marched your troop all the way from Seminole to Richardson when we made that move west. We were supposed to get a lot of head support, but it didn't materialize. So, we could have done a lot better on theater movement.
And I certainly remember a lot of time, a lot of long days and nights moving in the Bradley, drinking a lot of warm water out of water buffaloes and eating a lot of MREs. Yeah, sir. So next I'd ask, Iraq was more battle-tested recently in its war against Iran in the 80s. What were some of the fears or unknowns that you had as a leader or that you saw in the formation, and how did you handle them?
Well, we took them very seriously. They'd been in a long war with Iran, and had shown themselves to be good at concentrating artillery fires and establishing defenses. It was a big army. It was a 1 million-man army with good Soviet equipment, especially the Republican Guard. And I was most concerned with the problems of mines, set defenses, and enemy artillery. NBC figured into it. We were all concerned about chemical weapons, but the other things had more of my attention. Now, they organized as the Russians did. We knew their organizations and we knew their equipment, but we had not faced, in my experience, anything like the combined arms capability the Iraqi army had on paper. When we arrived in Saudi Arabia and began to see some operations of the Iraqis, I became much less concerned. There are projections that our operation was going to entail huge casualties. Some of the simulations being run in the United States. The 2nd ACR covering force showed very heavy casualties. We never believed that. Once we got a look at who was on the border in front of us and reviewed how they were operating, especially after the attack at Khafji in January, we were not contemptuous of them at all. We respected what they had, but we knew they were really not equipped, organized, or trained to our standards, and I had no doubt that we were going to win any fight we had with them.
From my perspective, just as a young member of squad, a dismounted scout out of the back of a Bradley, I was concerned about NBC because I was the unmasking private, so that was something near and dear to my heart. I was concerned about the T-72 main battle tank because we had a healthy respect for it, and even though we had a lot of M1s and all of the proficiency and capability that you had described in the ACR, that T-72 was something that we had a lot of respect for and did not want to necessarily see in any large number if we weren't oriented appropriately. And then, of course, the Scud. The Scud missile got a lot of press, and so there was a lot of, maybe boogeyman about the Scud, whether or not that was ever going to be something that would reach us or find us or deliver chemical munitions. I think there was just a lot of, if you were so lucky to get a copy of Stars and Stripes blowing across the desert, it would certainly have a lot of sensationalism about the Scud missile. So I think for me, it was NBC, the Scud, and the T-72.
Yeah, I had the same concerns. And we dispersed the regiment. You'll recall when we were in Saudi Arabia, we set up like we did on the border. That is, we had company-size camps or positions spread all across the regimental front. We had a mission to screen the Corps, but we protected ourselves from fires by dispersion. And then during the operation, we counted on movement to make us hard to target. The other thing that we had that you probably were not aware of is we had a very competent field artillery brigade in our support with target acquisition radar. And when we got fired on by artillery, we had rockets going back at them almost immediately.
That's incredible. And I do remember being in a troop-sized tactical assembly area, being spread out and really so spread out. And this was something that was striking for me as a young man from Ohio that had joined the Army not even 7 or 8 months prior, and being away from home for the first meaningful amount of time in my life and finding myself on the other side of the world in the middle of the Saudi Arabian desert. I was struck by just how flat and desolate it was. I remember thinking that it looked almost kind of like a crappy parking lot. It was just flat and dirty and rocky. Or at least I had envisioned that there was going to be the Lawrence of Arabia sands, this kind of the beautiful desert, and it was just like a parking lot. And it wasn't until the armored vehicles rolled over it that it would break through that crust layer, and you'd find some loose sand underneath. But that top level crust, you drove the trucks over them or whatever, or you walked across it. It was just like a parking lot, and that impacted us in the vehicles because you couldn't make sharp turns, otherwise you'd throw track because you'd get into those ruts. And that was a real thing. I remember we actually threw track in contact once, and it made such a loud pop. I thought we had got hit. We had to get out. It was like a NASCAR pit crew. So you talk about training. We got that track back on probably in a record time. If we would have been able to time that, I'm sure there was some sort of Army record there. But yeah, I remember that about the open desert.
There's another thing about the open desert. Another point that I'd make here, too, and that is that it was not uniform. There were areas of soft sand, subcus, which would suck you right up. We did a special reconnaissance for 7th Corps to be sure that the division tactical assembly areas were going to be adequate, that big rocks on the surface back out there were not going to prohibit the use of trucks. And in the attack, I guess it was 2nd Squadron discovered a large soft area of sand just over a rock outcropping that ran for some miles. Reported that back duly. And yet, even within the regiment, that information did not get passed, and we wound up sticking most of our ammo trucks from the support squadron because that terrain information didn't get passed back.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I didn't know about that, but I certainly remember the other piece of it, which I think is related, is how so many people think that the desert is nothing but sunny and hot. And I certainly remember it being very cold, very windy, at times rainy, and just, it had a host of environmental harsh qualities that don't necessarily go with what you may assume in the open desert.
And, our regimental fighting concept depended on air cavalry. I mean, that was part of the concept. We were going to find them with air scouts pushed way out, engage them with artillery, and then bring up the armored force, the heavy force. That didn't pan out. There was so little flying weather that our 4th Squadron was grounded for about half the operation.
We all have our war stories. I'm sure you have an interesting or funny story from Operation Desert Storm. Now, would you mind sharing one with us?
We're a pretty loose unit. We had a lot of laughs around the command post, and I think between the squadrons and regiments, there were some funny things that happened, and there were some things that only appeared funny after they had happened. But one of my recollections from Desert Storm was bringing on attachments and supporting units, and the fact that they were often gassed at what we were going to do. They did not come to the desert in order to be in the leading formation of the 7th Corps, and in some cases they had to be cajoled and counseled quite a bit to infuse them with the proper cavalry spirit. Our MP company came rather late, a good MP company out of Alabama, the 214th MP company. They were funny to me because they resisted the notion of going forward with the covering force for about a week. It took a lot of counseling by the sergeant major and myself to convince them this was a good deal and they were going to cover themselves with glory. But what their reference point was that there were brigades of regular Army MPs in theater, and those guys were back at the ports and on the routes and operating in depth. The guys who had just been mobilized were going to be asked to be ahead of every MP company in the Army out there with 7th Corps. So, retrospectively, that's kind of funny.
As I think back, I certainly have a host of them because, as you can imagine, as the youngest member of the formation, lowest ranking, newest, I had a host of challenges in front of me and learning my way around the organization and learning about the Army. And so seemingly everything that I experienced probably had a funny component to it, at least to somebody. But I do remember it was during the ground invasion, and there was a point in time where we had taken control of a group of prisoners. The long and short of it was there was a group that was moved, and then there was a lot of sense of urgency that we had to get going because, as you know, the tempo was there. We had to keep moving. There was a point where there was a movement of personnel, and somehow there was 2 prisoners that were unaccounted for. And there was a realization as we were called over to take accountability of these 2 guys, and we needed to move them from point A to point B. And it wasn't an option that they were going to walk. And so we were all kind of standing there looking at these 2 guys who we had handcuffed, flex tied. And we said, well, we can't leave them here. Hire's telling us to move them. And of course, as predicted, the young soldier there from the small town recommends that we strap them to the vehicle. I said, we said, well, we can't do that either. We don't know what to do with them. And so they say, here's what you're going to do. You're going to get in the back of the Bradley. Well, the one fella that was supposed to be back there with me moved to the other track. And they essentially put me in the back of this Bradley. Now, mind you, this thing is cubed out with ammunition boxes. So there is the equivalent of like 2 phone booths width. And I get back by the hellhole, and the driver hands me his .45. And then they put these 2 prisoners on the jump seat that's right by the door, and one's sitting on the other one's lap. And then they close this door. So now you're in this dark Bradley with only the light, the sunlight coming through the periscope vision blocks. And we proceed to start driving. And And, sir, I mean, the back of this Bradley, I mean, you might as well just be getting thrown around in a clothes dryer, right? So we're bashing back and forth and sand is coming in the sides and it's dusty and it's hot. I mean, we're practically falling in each other's arms. And I've got the pistol, and just looking at these guys' eyes, I don't know who was more intimidated by the whole experience, me or them. But nevertheless, we moved these two guys this requisite amount of distance and opened up the door, and I couldn't have been more happy to get them out of the vehicle. But as I was in that process of moving from point A to point B, I couldn't help but think, where the hell was I and what the hell was I doing?
Yeah, that's funny. And I was very conscious at the time that the whole regiment was green. This was our first combat in many years. So there were going to be some experiences like that where you're making it up as you go along and seeing a lot of things for the first time. We also got some funny stories out of prisoners who spoke English, a couple of whom had been college students in the United States and had come back to Iraq and been caught up in the mobilization, and they were funny because they were so happy to see us. I had a letter from one of the tankers in 2nd Squadron relating how the first prisoners they came across bothered his tank commander because they were climbing up on the tank and kissing him. They were that happy to be out from under the thumb of their own chain of command.
Well, I'll tell you, these two young men and myself in the back of this tight, dusty, hot Bradley, I think we were just wanting to get the hell out of there. Okay, sir. Well, that wraps up the formal questions. Sir, what I'd like to do now, run a quick speed round. And the concept here is that I will walk us through just a series of chronological memory points. And what I'd like to do is I'll state the chronological milestone, and then I'd ask for you to just give me your recollection of kind of what was going on for you, what were you thinking at the time, what were you doing, just some sort of a glimpse into the eyes of the regimental commander. And then I will counter that with what was going on for me as the regiment's youngest soldier. So the first chronological milestone, sir, is pre-deployment.
Well, before we were notified, I was dealing with a lot of rumors and a lot of discomfort in the regiment. The soldiers were not sure what was going on. They had suspicions, as I've said earlier, that we were going to be deployed. So I spent a whole lot of time just circulating through the regiment, talking to soldiers about what I knew and what we didn't know and what we had to be prepared to do. Related to that was the matter of family readiness. We had family support groups back then, but they weren't well developed or evenly developed, and there was a lot of action going on pre-deployment about figuring out how the rear detachment was going to work and how those family support groups would function.
Yes, sir. And when I think about that same time frame, well, first off, I was in basic training. I had graduated from high school that year, and so I went through basic training, 1-station unit training to become a cavalry scout. And so during that time, as you were wrestling with those leader problems, I was learning how to be a soldier, and I was watching as the drill sergeants got very intense following August. After August and Saddam's move into Kuwait, everything kind of ratcheted up in basic training, and it got real serious. And then we went through the fall, and as I got assigned, and I didn't have the luxury of picking where I was going, I lucked out in landing in 2nd ACR. I arrived, as stated, December 1st and went wheels up with the main body on December 7th, so there wasn't a whole lot of pre-deployment for me with the organization, but I would add just a humorous vignette in that I showed up to 1st Squadron on December 3rd, found my way literally doing the duffel bag drag. I was wearing my green Class A's and dragging my duffel bag up to my room where there was a bunch of strip bunks and some of my, eventually to be friends, they weren't very friendly that night, but as I did process elimination to figure out which bunk was mine, no one had much to say to me because nobody wanted a new addition. They had completed their training. They had finalized their teams. And I think that everybody thought that adding anybody to their small team was going to maybe make them less successful. So I'll just go out on a limb and say they weren't too happy to see me. But as I did process elimination and picked which bunk was mine and started to unpack my duffel bag, one of them looked up at me and said, "Don't bother unpacking that bag. Just put it in that box." And I said, "Oh, well, that's funny. What's going on?" And he said, "We leave for Saudi Arabia on Thursday." I said, "Okay. Is there a phone around here?" "Okay, sir." So the next milestone chronologically is our time in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia.
That was a nightmare, actually. We were very fortunate to have those ships per squadron that I described. Everybody came in on his own ship, but things were moving so fast. The theater was not prepared to receive us. And I'm sure that you have recollections from the 1st Squadron because the 1st Squadron got the worst of it. But they were flying soldiers in far ahead of their equipment. The intermediate staging area that the 1st Infantry Division was running was inadequate to accept those soldiers, and we had people sleeping on the ground. We had people sleeping on tent pads that were uncovered but barely dry. There were long lines for chow and even latrines. My job at that time was to push very hard on theater and corps to try to slow down the movement of troops into theater and to hurry up getting the things we needed so we could clear out of the intermediate staging area and get up to our area of operations.
I think we have a commonality there in that you use the word nightmare, and I would say that Dhahran for me was also nightmarish. For me, as the youngest, lowest ranking member of my troop, you can only imagine that as the requirements for details came down from the squadron and through the troop, you can imagine whose name made it to the top of each of those lists. So if there was anything that was undesirable to be done, you better believe that this private was the man on the case. So I frequently found myself being sent to the latrines to burn the barrels, and the barrels had to burn. It was an austere environment, and the barrels had to burn, and you had to use diesel to burn them. And the diesel would go out if you didn't continue to expose it to new air. So not only did you have to burn it with diesel, but you had to stir it as you burned it, otherwise it would go out. And if it went out, well, then you had to light it again. And there was, flies and everything else, and you can only imagine. And that was a pretty common chore of mine while in Dhahran. So I was ready to get the hell out of there.
Yeah, that goes back to Vietnam, and probably before that. We made a lot of progress in the Army in many things, but not in that.
Okay, sir. The next chronological milestone then is our time out in the Saudi Arabian desert.
It was a great relief to get out of the ports and be into an area of our own. I found the troops exhilarated by it, and we'd come with a training plan, as I mentioned. We're training multi-echelon almost every day. There's a limit in how many miles I could let you guys put on the tracks. We were productively employed. We got a false report right after the air campaign started that an Iraqi unit had crossed the border to our north, and we flexed to the regiment. We didn't alert, scrambled out of our camps, moved to defensive positions to intercept that unit. You probably will recall it. It was a great shakeout for the regiment, and it just built a lot of confidence among us that we could do that. There were some irritations, too. We were first in country, so support was not adequate for a long time. But by and large, I remember that as a good time in which I did a whole lot of pressing again on Corps to get us support, but where we did get to make good preparations for the operation.
Yes, sir. And I definitely remember finding myself on the other side of the world in the middle of the Saudi Arabian desert and really just kind of doing some self-reflection of how did I get here and what is this place? Who are these people? Learning my team. Because again, I deployed with a group of strangers. Out in the open desert, we certainly did training as you described, sir, but that could only fill so many hours of the day. And so there was still a lot of waiting. And we just had really no idea of what was happening, what was coming. I mean, certainly our leaders would keep us informed. It wasn't like we were unnecessarily in the dark, but they only knew what they knew. There was a little bit of, as I recall, kind of the transistor radio of sorts that you could listen to a broadcast at times. But there was just the harshness of the elements. I remember the wind and the heat and the cold and the scorpions and snakes and lizards and, all the different kind of stuff that is out in the desert, and lots of waiting, lots of getting to know the team, and then just a little bit of balanced with training, still a little bit of stir craziness. And for me personally, a lot of practicing unmasking.
Yeah, if I can add, that's an aspect of deployments and operations that we don't address formally, I don't think, in doctrine. That is, how do you occupy your time while you're waiting for the force to form? This may not be a problem in future operations, I don't know. But we had shipped sports equipment and videotapes and all kinds of things down there to Saudi Arabia, not really anticipating how long we'd have to wait for the operation. But you do have to think of those things. I remember there were active sports and that kind of business, and that I had to finally forbid flag football because we were getting so many injuries. The orthopedic bill was too high. But how you spend your time, especially when you're limited with fuel, ammunition, and track miles or flying hours, deserves some thought.
Yes, sir. And I remember very clearly playing some very aggressive flag football, and I also remember getting very good at the card game spades. Okay, sir.
I got one more.
Go for it.
Another great story from this. I know we're running on, but we're talking about funny things that happened. We had one of our soldiers, a B Troop soldier, as a matter of fact, got injured, I think, during all of that. He was down in an Army hospital near the ports, and General Frank's Corps commander came around to see this guy. He came around to see soldiers, and I believe the man's name was McLemore. Anyway, he got to McLemore's bed, and I chatted him up, asked him how things were going, how he was feeling. He was feeling much better. So General Frank said kind of casually, is there anything I can do for you? And McLemore said, yes, sir, you can get me back to my unit today. You're on a helicopter. How about taking me? And to General Frank's credit, he did it. Got the shoulder discharge. Put him on his helicopter. Flew him back to B Troop.
Wow. Okay, sir. The next chronological waypoint then would be crossing the berm.
It was a great relief to be going. Everybody was anxious to go. We went early. We went a day before the operation was to begin, and the idea was to push a security bubble out past the berm so the engineers could clear lanes for the wheeled vehicles, particularly those of the two divisions that were following us. So that initial move for us was earlier than for most. I remember getting into Iraq, making first contact with a few of the border police, and coming across the first Iraqi positions while the engineers worked. It was really sort of a confidence building part of the operation because we were all out there doing what we're supposed to do.
Yes, sir. And I definitely remember just incredible anticipation. One of the things I didn't mention about the open desert, but I'll never forget, was the stars in the sky being so far out there, so far away from any ambient light. And the sky was just like a circuit board. And I remember sitting out there in an LPOP with one of my battle buddies, and we were going to roll in the next day, and just talking about that and the anticipation. And then I remember and going from that position of a lot of, yes, training, but a lot of waiting around too, to all of a sudden being in the, sprint and go, always moving, but in these episodic moments of kind of chaos and contact. And it was always very managed, at least from my perspective. It never felt like the unit was, wasn't doing exactly what it was supposed to do. But from the eyes of a young soldier who was in the back of the Bradley, I'm not looking at a map. I'm not even seeing the open terrain for that matter. You're just getting thrown around and told on a moment's notice to dismount with the machine gun, or to prepare to reload the tow, or any number of things that are happening in and out of contact. And then, as I had described before, throw and track while in contact was quite an exciting event in not a great way.
No doubt.
Okay, sir. So the next one, and this kind of goes with what I was just hitting on a little bit, but the rapid movement and maneuver across the open desert, and then that kind of sequence of being in and out of contact.
Met my expectations, really. It was a huge movement of equipment and people, and we were two up, two back when we started out. We had the aviation squadron in front of us, but we had second and third squadron committed. First squadron was following on the regimental right, east. The support squadron Apaches were also in depth, but I had anticipated that the movement was going to be at about 10 miles an hour average. We had to do that because engineer equipment and guns had to keep up. You can't run away from your base of fire when you're maneuvering a force, and although the M1 tank and the Bradley are very fast, Stryker's very fast, you can't outdrive what your base of fire can do. So I paced the movement of the regiment to the movement of the Field Artillery Brigade, essentially. They had trained with us, so they moved as fast as they could. So we had to orient on the enemy, but also on the moving friendly troops behind us. And we could not run so far ahead of the divisions that they could not move up to support us or exploit the advantages that we developed in our own fighting. So it was kind of a tricky movement.
Yes, sir. And I certainly remember it, and it's neat hearing you describe the tempo and the synchronization as well as the mutual support aspect, all of which makes a ton of sense to me in my current rank and position. But certainly at that time, it was a little bit mysterious, as it felt like it sometimes we would be moving as if we were chasing somebody, and then there'd be other times where we'd be sitting still, and it would seem like kind of the world was erupting around us, but we weren't going anywhere. When you were set, you were really kind of urging to move. And when you were moving, certainly as a young soldier in the back of the Bradley, you don't really know. And it's not like there's situational awareness reports being shared other than what you hear over the CVC by monitoring the net. And so it was interesting because there wasn't a whole lot of situational awareness for a young soldier, just a matter of being in contact or not, being stopped or moving, certainly dismounting to attend to prisoners or security, or to inspect bunkers and look for things. That happened a couple of different times. I certainly remember, I think the one thing that stood out to me in terms of being on the move was reloading a tow in contact. It was really interesting because I'm sure my gunner, who will remain nameless, would say that I probably pulled the toe out at the wrong angle, but I think that maybe his bezel ring was just a little bit off. Either way, as that tube came back with a great deal of adrenaline, it kind of lodged itself in the cargo hatch. And so you've got contact going on around us, and this expended 71 Echo tube is lodged between the back of the hammerhead and the far corner of the cargo hatch. And I'm pulling this thing with all I got, and the gunner's screaming in the net at me because he's got that toe up. I mean, he's sitting duck at that point. And so I finally got it out, got a new missile up there, dropped the hatch, pounded on the door, and he was back in business. But there was a moment there where, I felt similar to those stories where, somebody picks a telephone pole up off a child or something, right? I mean, I was trying to pull this thing out with all I got, and I finally got it. So that was high adventure. Okay, sir. The next one was the forward passage of lines. This is one that I think historically certainly has some aspect of credence to the story of the regiment. I mean, a forward passage of lines in a combat environment, passing 1st Infantry Division through our lines. What do you remember about that, sir?
I remember it was a tough mission. It was an operation that we did at night in contact, and with a lot of adjustment as the operation took place. One of our major successes was getting that done without fratricide as the division passed through us. But it was difficult. It required a lot of leader-to-leader talk between the deputy commander and the assistant division commander of the 1st Infantry Division. It required great discipline on the line of contact where you guys were, in marking lanes and passing the word about who was coming. And there's a tricky element of handing off the artillery. Guys who were shooting for us began shooting for the other unit. We had a lot of time to get it done because the 1st Infantry Division was a long way behind us. And a better passage of lines would have happened earlier and faster. This was supposed to happen at the 6-0 East. We moved to the 7-0 and the 7-3 because the 1st Infantry Division had taken so long to come forward and had to refuel and a number of other things. But I remember it as it being an exciting night. I was behind the 3rd Squadron with the Artillery Brigade Commander managing that business. And in retrospect, I realized that we had put a lot of emphasis on passage of lines and the related task of breaching an obstacle back in our training. The platoon leaders, troop commanders knew that drill pretty well, marked the lanes very well, and just did a great job. The elements that passed through us did a good job themselves. I know one of those commanders very well, and he was in awe of the preparations that our soldiers made for that passage lines. Lanes were marked, people ready to hand over, information flowed. It was pretty good recall, these are all green troops at night in contact. So it was difficult, it was stressful, but it was very successful thanks to coming back to NCO leadership and small unit excellence, thanks to the guys who were doing it on the line of contact.
I certainly remember that. I remember that operation. I didn't understand the significance of it. I didn't understand the size and scope of it really until about 5 years later when I was a West Point cadet in military history class. It was the first time that I fully started to appreciate what the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment had done in Desert Storm. But at that point in time, as a young private on the ground, I know that people were moving with a sense of urgency and precision. I remember the lane marking. I remember a lot of preparations, and I had never seen anything like this before. Again, new to the unit and new to these particular skills and drills, none of which had been introduced in basic training for forward passage of lines, let alone in contact at night. But I remember there being a lot of action and activity, a lot of preparation, a lot of very deliberate direction by section sergeants and platoon sergeants and all as you've described. And then all of a sudden it got really busy and really chaotic as you started to have all kinds of different vehicles moving in around what was once a reasonably spread out, tactically acceptable environment. It just seemed like it got very crowded and very active for a period of time, as you would imagine, and as you remember, sir.
Yeah, it's interesting, too, in that, the ethos of the U.S. Army, certainly of the U.S. Cavalry, is mission orders and mission execution, freedom of action in small unit leaders. There are times when directive control is necessary. It's the only thing that will keep you safe and make you effective, where you must direct, very small actions like passage lines through a specific lane, and your leaders have got to be able to step between those modes and understand when one is appropriate and when it's not.
Sir, the next chronological marker here is our operations in northern Iraq, the humanitarian service mission in northern Iraq that we got diverted to.
That was a huge motivation problem for me. The troopers, had done their duty in the attack, defeated the people in front of them, passed into reserve, and the war was over. And all the talk then was about going back to Saudi Arabia and shipping home. And we got this additional mission to go up to the Euphrates line and observe the ceasefire activities there. And so it was a relief. Again, the soldiers picked it up enthusiastically, but it was a big change to reorient on doing that other mission. And it was pretty difficult. It was about a 100-mile march, as I recall. We came in and replaced elements of the 82nd and 101st Divisions, and they were light forces, so we were going to do it completely differently. And our soldiers witnessed a lot of brutality on the part of the Iraqis against their own people, the Iraqi army against their own people. There was an uprising in the Euphrates Valley, as you may recall. My principal concern is protecting our own soldiers and also dealing with the number of refugees who came out of those towns and transited our AO heading down to Basra or Saudi Arabia.
It's great to hear that you understood and saw and considered the morale issues at that point, because certainly I remember, at least at the private level, all that we were thinking was, hey, first in, first out. Here we were, felt like we were on our way back down to Saudi Arabia. And then at least as the story went across the ranks, they had this emerging border mission. And here you had the ACE Border Patrol outfit in the United States Army just happened to be available. And so they gave us the diversion to head up there. I do remember getting up there and just being really kind of amazed. I talked already about the terrain and the nature and just the environmental aspects of the open desert. And we got up there and just, completely different environmental characteristics, a lot of rolling hills and scrub brush and standing water and sand gnats. And it was just a really miserable place to sit still in. And we had to do a lot of sitting still.
Yeah, the gnats were awful. And it was mud. We'd come out of the sand. We were now getting vehicles mired in real mud. And it was a difficult mission. It was very active when we arrived there. We were dealing with a lot of civilian casualties that probably didn't register too much in First Squadron, but the night we pulled in there, our aid station was one of the first things that went in on the ground, and it was immediately swamped with wounded civilians and women in labor and injured children and all that stuff. It was an interesting, difficult mission.
Okay, sir, ending on a high note, redeployment.
Yeah, redeployment was a great relief. It was, we went back to King Khalid Military City, KKMC, out of the Euphrates Valley. We really were. We did get the first in, first out treatment once they were done. So we went 1st and 7th Corps, but I remember that there was great relief when we got back to Saudi Arabia. We went to Camp 1 for most of our redeployment in Jubail, same place we'd shipped into. And there were phones, and there was good food, and there were recreational facilities, but there was also a whole lot of work in getting vehicles repainted, downloaded, prepared for transportation. It was busy days, but morale being very high because everybody knew we were going home.
Yes, sir, and I remember the same, just being on a real high in terms of getting to really start to think about what was next and try to make sense of everything that you had been through. Sir, the one thing I wanted to ask you before we wrap that up, and could I ask you how was your sleep management across that time period, 82 hours or 100 hours? How did you manage your rest plan, or was there one?
Yeah, we had a rest plan. We'd learned that at the CTCs, and the pattern of operations facilitated that. We had Deputy Commander ran the TAC, XO ran the main, and they had sleep plans with the senior operations reps. I slept when I could, and I was getting 6 hours of sleep a night. I had a little tent thrown up next to the TAC CP, and except for the night we did the passage lines, I got at least 6 hours sleep, and I was conscious of the need to do that.
Yes, sir. Well, that's one of the greatest challenges, as you know, of maneuvers and of demanding operations is just balancing that rest plan, because sleep is a weapon. And so something that we struggle with today, but I think you're exactly spot on. I remember certainly falling asleep in the back of the Bradley when it would be stopped or not, or, because I think that for us, that not knowing when you're moving next, not knowing when you're stopping, not knowing, there's just kind of this perpetual state of, well, you just need to remain ready. And then, you can just close your eyes. And as things start happening, you open them.
I've always admired the way some soldiers can, sleep when they get the time.
Yes, sir.
I can't do that very easily, but a lot of people can do it.
Yeah, I think what I always said was the only thing I need to sleep is permission.
Yeah. When I was a squadron commander in 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment, we had a couple of medics from William Beaumont Hospital come down and do a sleep deprivation study on our training and reforger operations. And they came up with some really interesting stuff. I mean, they had the statistics that showed the error rate in a rested unit and a tired unit, or a rested officer and a tired officer, and the way in which all soldiers begin to slow down and make mistakes at a certain point when they haven't had sleep. So as you were saying, sleep really is an element of combat power.
I will pass it over to you, sir, for any final thoughts.
Well, it was a great challenge, opportunity, and honor to fight with the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment in Desert Storm. As a Vietnam veteran, took great pleasure in the overall readiness of the Army at that point. We had made great strides from the 1970s until 1991. All units of the professional Army that went into Desert Storm, and for that matter, Just Cause in Panama, were ready for the challenge and did superbly well for inexperienced troops. There's a lesson there to you guys on active duty today. There's nothing more important than maintaining training readiness and personnel readiness, and I know you guys are oriented hard on that. There's no better unit to do that than the 2nd Cavalry. That's always been the case.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you so much. And for our listeners out there, I mean, what an absolute treat and treasure to be able to hear from Lieutenant General Retired Holder, formerly the 65th Colonel of the regiment and the Regimental Commander during Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. We've talked today about so many important leader lessons that are absolutely pertinent today. We talked about training proficiency. We talked about discipline. We talked about leadership at the small unit level, being prepared and being confident, having families ready. We talked about the logistical complexities, and we talked about the real hardships of a soldier at ground level. And while I find some humor in it today, I'll tell you, some of it was not so humorous when I was doing it, but it made me stronger and made me better. And at the end of the day, that's part of the military experience. I think in closing, it's right and proper on this 30th anniversary of the ground invasion for Operation Desert Storm that we do take a moment just to recognize the 7 dragoons that did not come back from that operation: Sergeant Nels Moeller, Sergeant Dodge Powell, Sergeant William Strenlow, Corporal James McCoy, Specialist James Miller Jr., Specialist Thomas Jarrell, and PFC Aaron Howard. So certainly our prayers go out to their families, and our prayers go out to all those living dragoons out there who served honorably in Desert Storm and Desert Shield for that matter. Just hats off to you out there, wherever you are, and just know that the 65th Colonel of the Regiment, Lieutenant General Retired Holder, and the 81st Colonel of the Regiment, myself, Colonel Joe Ewers, gratefully appreciate your service to this regiment and to our nation. And sir, again, thank you so much for your time today. It was a real treat.
My pleasure. All the best.
This is Dragoon 6 signing off.